Hi students, in this video we're going to take a look at a case Snyder versus Phelps. This case comes from 2011, so we're getting closer and closer to the current day. We're actually probably not going to get too much closer to the current day, we're actually going to fall back in time a little bit now, but that's okay. You know, the questions that we're raising in this class aren't about necessarily here's the most hot button issue of our time, but rather we're looking at the kinds of perennial issues that arise within the law. So again, we're in our unit on freedom and liberty, especially looking at the First Amendment and the free speech. And this case is about free speech, right? So Albert Snyder is the father of a Marine who was killed, and Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church came to protest outside of the funeral. And so what this cartoon depicts, right, is Lady Liberty here. Lady Liberty, Lady Justice, something like that. Saying, you know, you ever have one of those days when you really hate your job? She's holding this shield of free speech over Fred Phelps, who has a sign that says, "Thank God for dead soldiers." You might think, like, who would say that sort of thing? But Lady Liberty is protecting him nonetheless. And that's basically, you know, a quick summary of the case, right? That's the picture. All right, so let's look at the facts. The Westboro Baptist Church's congregation believes that God hates and punishes the U.S. for its tolerance of homosexuality, especially in the military. And it often expresses that view by picketing at military funerals. Right? So the idea is that Westboro Baptist Church, ultra-conservative, right, thinks that there's a problem, you know, homosexuality is wrong, and that the U.S. deserves criticism for tolerating homosexuality, especially allowing people who are homosexual to be in the military. So to express that view, it pickets at military funerals and says things, you know, like Snyder on that previous page, like, "Thank God for dead soldiers." Like, it's good that soldiers are dying. That will help us realize that what we're doing is problematic, or something like that. So in this case, Phelps, 2 of his daughters, and 4 of his grandchildren were picketing on public land approximately 1,000 feet from the Catholic Church where Marine Lance Corporal Matthew Snyder's funeral was being held. So they're about 1,000 feet away, 300 yards. They're a ways away. They're not right up close to it. Now, they didn't yell or use profanity. There was no violence associated with the picketing. They were just having a peaceful picket. Now, this picture isn't from this particular protest, but it's just a picture of Westboro Baptist Church in general. I thought, like, just to give you a sense for what these sorts of events might look like, here you go. Their signs said the following sorts of things at this particular picket protest. Said things like, "America is doomed," "Don't pray for the USA," "God hates fags," "God hates the USA," "God hates you," "Thank God for 9/11," "Thank God for IEDs," "Thank God for dead soldiers," "Pope in hell," "Priests rape boys," and "You're going to hell." All right, so that's some pretty, you know, hateful stuff. The question we need to ask is sort of whether or not these sorts of hateful things that they're saying should be protected by the First Amendment. So a few more details, right? So the funeral procession passed within 200 to 300 feet of the picketers. That's the procession. So as they're sort of driving away from the funeral, they get within 200 to 300 feet of the picketers. That's about a little less than a football field, right? The plaintiff, Albert Snyder, could see the picketers' signs, but he couldn't read the signs. He did, however, see their signs on the news that night, and his seeing their signs on the news caused him emotional injuries that resulted in depression and exacerbated pre-existing health conditions. One thing worth noting here is that in the trial, evidence is presented that suggests that these emotional injuries were significant, and you have psychologists and people testifying to the effect that that this event did in fact cause Albert Snyder serious emotional distress and had serious negative impacts on his psychological well-being. All right, so as a result, Snyder sues Fred Phelps, his daughters, and the Westboro Baptist Church, hereafter simply Westboro, for the intentional infliction of emotional distress, among other things. So there were a few charges leveled against Fred Phelps' daughters and the church, but some of those get dropped, and the sort of focus ends up being on this claim that Westboro is guilty of the intentional infliction of emotional distress. A jury had held Westboro liable for $2.9 million in compensatory damages, so that money would go to Snyder, and $8 million in punitive damages. That's just for just to punish them and discourage other people from doing the same thing. The district court remitted the punitive damages award to $2.1 million. Now, it's not clear exactly why they did that. It's not really important for our purposes. They said, $8 million is too much, we're going to reduce that. Now, the Court of Appeals overturned the ruling, arguing that the First Amendment protects Westboro's speech. So we haven't had many cases that involve this sort of long history, but I think it's worth taking a brief pause to explain sort of how this works. So in any case, there's sort of a trial at a more local, small level, and then it sort of moves its way up. So this case appears to be a federal case. That's actually not all that important, but the main thing is there's this sort of this first jury trial that happens, and then you can appeal that to the district court, and then in the district, a larger geographic region, it's going to take some cases and say, yeah, we're going to review this. That's what the district court does here. You can always appeal that ruling though to a higher level, right? In this case, it was appealed to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said, you know what, this ruling is not quite right. Westboro doesn't have to pay anything. The First Amendment protects Westboro's speech. So from there, we get like one final appeal on behalf of Albert Snyder, who appeals that ruling to the Supreme Court and says, hey, this lower court, the Court of Appeals, overturned the judgment in my favor. I think like you should sort this out. I don't think they did things right. And so it goes up to the Supreme Court. Of course, at any point along the way, a court might say, no, I think the lower court did a fine job. We're not going to hear this case. But the U.S. Supreme Court chose to take this case on and said, yeah, we need to settle this issue once and for all. Now, the central legal question in this case is this. Does the First Amendment, and in particular the free speech clause of the First Amendment, protect Westboro's speech? Again, it said Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, and the thought is if Snyder is going to be able to collect for intentional infliction of emotional distress, that looks like there's essentially a law that allows, that limits people's freedom to speak. So that's the question we're sort of going to ask, right? Does the First Amendment protect Westboro's speech? Why or why not? And again, right, as I said last time, you might feel a bit out of your depth. How am I supposed to evaluate this? Well, in a sense, I think it's just a kind of an abstract, it's a tricky question. So the founders a long time ago said Congress can't abridge the freedom of speech. What does that say about this case? Can the legal system punish Westboro for making the speech that he did? And I think it's important. Another thing that's important to note right here is this case is a civil case as opposed to a criminal case. So a criminal case would, if Westboro was found guilty there, they'd have to go to jail. Here, it's just a civil case, which means we're suing each other, right, for damages. We're trying to figure out if we need compensation, and so it's a little bit different. oftentimes when we think of the law, we think of the criminal law and ignore the civil law, but the civil law is still law, and the thought is, well, if we allow Albert Snyder to collect damages from Westboro Baptist Church, then there's, in a sense, a law that's going to discourage people from saying what they think. So, what do we think? Should the First Amendment protect this kind of speech? Should it not? That's, in a way, that's maybe the more philosophical question. So how did the Supreme Court rule? The Supreme Court ruled 8-1, right? So this is a pretty resounding defeat for Snyder and in favor of Phelps, right? And they ruled that the First Amendment does protect Westboro's speech, so Westboro doesn't have to pay anything to Snyder. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion, in which he argued that since Westboro's speech was on matters of public concern, and since the picketers had a right to be where they were, their speech deserved First Amendment protection. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at that opinion. So Chief Justice Roberts says, to succeed on a claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress in the state where it started, Maryland, a plaintiff must demonstrate a few things. First, that the defendant acted intentionally or recklessly. 2, they engaged in extreme or outrageous conduct. 3, that conduct caused 4, the plaintiff to suffer severe emotional distress. All right, so we can ask, was Westboro's behavior intentional or reckless? Was their conduct extreme or outrageous? Did it cause the severe emotional distress? Now, Roberts is going to say that it's also got to be true that the defendant's conduct must not address matters of public concern. Otherwise, that speech is going to be protected. So I think we might consider, right, some alternative scenarios and think about how we would want to rule in those. So we look at this particular case. Hey, they got as close as they could to this church where this funeral was going on. They said the sorts of things that they said, hoping to speak to these sorts of public issues, and then it was over, right? And what Snyder's going to say is that this was a kind of personal attack on him and his family. Phelps is going to say, no, we've got this sort of general view of the world that we're trying to get out there, and the best way to get it out there is to protest at these funerals. And so the question is sort of something about like, well, is this more speech on matters of public concern, or is it more speech on, I guess, a kind of private attack? So Roberts' first argument for his position is this. So the first premise says, the First Amendment protects speech on matters of public concern, provided that the speaker has the right to be where he or she is. So here the thought is like, the First Amendment is going to protect anything that's on matters of public concern if the speaker has a right to be in the place where he or she is speaking. Premise 2 says that Westboro's speech was on matters of public concern. It wasn't a personal attack. Right? It was just matters of public concern. And that Westboro had the right to be where it was. Conclusion, therefore the First Amendment protects Westboro's speech. Now this argument's pretty straightforward, right? It's valid. So the first premise is sort of saying, like, if the speech is on matter of public concern and the speaker has a right to be where they are, then the speech is protected. Premise 2 says Westboro met those 2 criteria. Conclusion, the First Amendment protects their speech. So which premise is controversial? I think, in a way, both of them have the potential to be a little controversial. I don't think anybody disagrees that Westboro had a right to be where they were. But I think there's sort of 2 questions. One is whether their speech was on matters of public concern, and whether or not it's being on matters of, like, maybe you say, well, it was on matters of public concern. Then you might say, well, just because it's on matters of public concern and that you have a right to be where they are, it doesn't mean you're protected if that also contains a personal attack. So it's a little unclear exactly which premise somebody's going to go after here, but premise 1 and premise 2 can both be criticized. So let's say we do sort of want to criticize. Was their speech on matters of public concern? Here Roberts is going to say, Westboro's speech expresses their view that God kills U.S. soldiers as punishment for its overly tolerant stance towards homosexuality, among other things. This is a matter of public concern, right? That's a view that you could have. You could think, it's God who's causing U.S. soldiers to die because of America's tolerance towards homosexuality. It's kind of a bizarre view to have, but we can see why someone might think that. Since this is a matter of public concern, right? If the United States could change its ways, then U.S. soldiers would stop dying, right? We can see why, if Westboro's right, it's important that they be able to say these things. So the content of their speech, right, at the end of the day, it's on a matter of public concern. It's important, and it's important for us to sort out together. Now, that raises this question about some of their signs, right? A few of their signs were viewed as containing messages related to Matthew Snyder. So I think they had signs that said something like, God hates you, and you're going to hell, things like that. They also had signs about homosexuality, so there's this question of whether or not they were suggesting that Matthew Snyder was homosexual. I don't necessarily want to weigh into the details there, but what Roberts is saying is that just because you say some things that seem like they might be related to Matthew Snyder doesn't mean that the things that they're saying weren't, on the whole, or for the most part, on matters of public concern. So let's dig a little bit deeper here. Was this speech a personal attack disguised as speech on matters of public concern? And here Roberts wants to say no. So he says, Westboro had expressed similar views in the past, and that suggests that their speech wasn't really a personal attack on the Snyders. Nothing that they were saying was something they just said to the Snyders. They'd said the same things before at other funerals. Of course, at those funerals, maybe no one had suffered the kind of emotional harm that Albert Snyder suffered, and so there was no way for those other places to sue, but here there was, and so things are a bit different. Roberts also says the context of Westboro's speech doesn't affect its content. So the fact that they were giving the speech, picketing, as close as they could to the funeral, doesn't mean that what they were saying wasn't on matters of public concern. So there were maybe a lot more neutral sites that they could have gone to, but he doesn't think that they're going to this funeral means that the speech is necessarily about the funeral or about Matthew Snyder. So he grants, right? No one denies that Westboro protested where it did in order to get more media attention. Roberts wants to grant that. He also doesn't want to deny that its speech was harmful to Albert Snyder. So he's granting that. He says, in the end, right, speech on matters of public concern that takes place in a public place deserves special protection. So he's sort of saying, this is all really unfortunate that it happened. No one's denying that Albert Snyder was harmed, and no one denies that Westboro is just trying to get media attention. But at the end of the day, this is sort of a sad consequence of the rules that we need to promote a flourishing country, which is widespread protections of free speech. So an example, right, that's along similar lines is flag burning. So some people see flag burning as extremely offensive, right? It upsets their sensibilities. They said, I fought for that flag. You're burning it offends me. But we think flag burning should be protected because it's a way of saying something that's important that we allow people to say, like, America's on the wrong track, it's doing the wrong thing. We should change what we're doing. We need to allow people to say that. So the other sort of question that Roberts takes up is this question of whether or not Westboro's speech was outrageous, and whether or not it's being outrageous maybe makes it okay to penalize them. And here, Roberts just says, like, I don't really care whether it's outrageous or not. How outrageous speech is has no effect on whether or not it should be protected. So he says, regardless, the First Amendment protects all sorts of speech, including speech that we consider outrageous. If it didn't protect outrageous speech, then people would be unable to voice certain opinions, namely opinions that other people consider outrageous. So just because something is sort of bizarre or rare or hurtful to a group of people, it outrages them, right? That is not going to be a great criteria for determining whether or not the speech is protected, because we need to be open to the possibility that people are wrong and that the outrageous claims are true. All right, and so there's a kind of second argument that Roberts gives for his view, and that's this. So if the First Amendment doesn't protect Westboro speech, then it doesn't protect public debate about important public issues. But the First Amendment should be protecting public debate about important public issues. Therefore, this First Amendment should protect Westboro speech. So I think we can see Roberts's first and second arguments as sort of fitting together. So his first says, speech on matters of public concern is protected as long as you have a right to be where you are. And then you might say, like, why do we have to protect all that speech? And here he's saying, because we need to protect debate about these public issues. So the reason we protect the public speech is because we need to protect the debate, and that's what we're doing here. That's what the First Amendment was about. That's why we think that this speech ought to be protected. Now, like I said before, the decision was 8-1, with Justice Alito being the only dissenting opinion. And I should acknowledge that I kind of like Alito's dissenting opinion here. Like, I think I find myself drawn to it. So what does it say? Alito says, although Westboro's speech addressed matters of public concern, it also did two things. One, it made no significant contribution to public debate. So Roberts said, it's all about protecting public debate. But Alito's saying, yeah, but did what they said really contribute to public debate in any significant way? His answer to that is no. And he also points out that it contained a personal attack. Right? He thinks it did attack Matthew Snyder. And as evidence this, he notes a few things. So first, the content. Signs saying, you're going to hell, who's the you? The fact that if you read the case, you'll see that they released a press release and some other things that said, we're going to be protesting at this funeral. They released another note that said, for Matthew Snyder's parents, saying that they were bad parents and criticizing them. And so he's sort of saying there is this sort of personal attack going on here. So not just the content, right? Saying you're going to hell, who's that directed to? It seems like Matthew Snyder. But also the context, right? They could have picketed any place else. When you sort of combine the content with the context, you get a personal attack. Now, I think it is worth thinking a bit about the fact that they could have protested these other places. And Alito is going to sort of emphasize that had they protested those other places, they wouldn't have got as much attention, and be critical of this idea that like places, something like Westboro Church should be able to protest wherever it thinks it can get the most attention. Obviously, like aggravating a family is going to get you the most attention. And so the idea here is that you don't have a right to speak in whatever public location is going to give you the most attention. You have the right to speak in public locations, but you can't always get as close to some person you're attacking to make that speech. That's the idea. So Alito is going to sort of make two kinds of arguments for his view. The first says, The First Amendment doesn't protect vicious personal attacks, even if those attacks are embedded within speech on public issues. So Westboro speech, insofar as it constitutes a vicious personal attack, the First Amendment doesn't protect it. So Alito's saying, yep, go ahead and speak on public issues as much as you want, but you can't sort of include a personal attack within that public speech. The second argument is that basically we don't need the First Amendment to say this in order to protect the public debate about the important issues. And so we don't need to read the First Amendment as protecting Westboro's speech in order for it to protect public debate about those issues. If that's true, then we shouldn't read the First Amendment in that way, right? Conclusion, we shouldn't read the First Amendment as protecting Westboro's speech. So Roberts, his whole opinion is sort of centered around this idea that we need to protect Westboro's speech, even though it's hateful, even though it's messed up, it's harmed somebody. You know, it had all these harmful effects, right? But we need to protect it because we need to protect public debate about public issues. And Justice Alito is saying, no, we don't need to protect this speech in order to still have the debate in the public square about Americans' tolerance of homosexuality. So that it's whatever kind of speech we do need to protect that public debate, that's worth protecting. But this speech isn't necessary. We don't need to protect this speech in order to protect that debate. All right. So what's the central philosophical question here? What's the question that we want to sort of come away trying to answer? Here's one way to put it, right? The question is something like this. Can some speech, even speech that addresses matters of public concern, be so likely to cause harm, be so harmful that we're justified in outlawing or prohibiting it? So hate speech is the example. It's tempting to think that hate speech is outlawed, but it turns out that it's not, right? We can say all sorts of hateful things and be protected, right? As long as they're not personal attacks. But you might think there's some speech, like this speech here, that is just so likely to cause people to suffer emotionally that we don't need to protect it. Rather, we can say to Westboro, well, no, you can't protest by this funeral. You need to protest at the Capitol building or at this location, wherever, a neutral site. So that leads us, I think, even to maybe a more general kinds of question that is where we'll sort of end this unit on free speech specifically. And the question here is like, what, if any, limits should be put on the freedom of speech? Should there be anything that people just can't say? Or should they be able to say basically anything they want as long as it matters of public concern, even if it's likely to harm other people? So that's a question that we're going to be left with. All right. Hope all is well. We'll see you later.